Now, the 5-day Brexit bill debate continues at Westminster later after yesterday's dramatic events in the House of Commons. The Speaker, John Bercow, came under intense criticism for allowing an amendment which led to another defeat for the government. Meanwhile, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is in West Yorkshire this morning, where he'll make a speech to party members arguing that Theresa May will lose her right to govern if she loses the main Brexit vote on Tuesday. Meanwhile, the government is considering giving extra protections to workers and the environment in order to win support for its withdrawal agreement from some Labour MPs. So let's go to Westminster and take stock with our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. Morning, Norman. Labour working on a number of fronts here, aren't they? But even if the Prime Minister wins the support of some Labour MPs for her deal, are we talking, anywhere close to the sorts of numbers that she needs to win that vote next week?
Not initially. I think the widespread assumption at Westminster is Mrs May's deal next week will go down pretty much whatever happens. But if Mrs May was to go back to Brussels, come back with another deal, maybe come back again, perhaps there could be movement. And what we are seeing, it seems, is an attempt to build bridges, with the government today poised to signal it will accept an amendment put down by a group of Labour MPs from Leave supporting constituencies seeking to bolt on to Mrs May's deal some of the demands that Mr Corbyn and others have been making in terms of guaranteeing employment rights, social rights, environmental conditions, climate change standards, all the sorts of things that Mr Corbyn has been demanding, opening up the question that could some Labour MPs be won over down the line to backing Mrs May's deal. Well, this morning the Labour front bench was sounding distinctly lukewarm about all that, with the Shadow Justice Secretary Richard Burgon suggesting it was just a desperate manoeuvre by Mrs May.
Obviously, workers' rights are important, but I would take the newspaper stories about that with a pinch of salt. We'd want to see legally binding promises in relation to the protection of workers' rights. And also, I have to say, the history of the Conservative Party and workers' rights is not a very positive one. So I take the whole thing with a pinch of salt.
Well, I'm joined now by the Labour MP John Mann, one of those who put down that amendment which the government is now seemingly going to accept. Why did you do this?
Well, we've got our own red lines. It's got nothing to do with Mrs May. These are some of the red lines, not all of them, that we have. And she's had her own red lines all the way through. Well, we've got some. And employment rights, workers' rights, environmental standards, health and safety, they're part of our red lines. We do not want to see a Brexit where we become some kind of Singapore economy, where it's a race to the bottom, where we try and undercut everyone else, where workers lose out. What we want is to compete by being the best in the world.
And if Mrs May, as seems now likely, accepts those red lines, does that mean you are more likely, and other Labour MPs more likely, to back Mrs May's deal?
Of course it does, but it doesn't mean that people are going to be rushing on Tuesday to do so. And indeed, this is the start of the process. I could reasonably say perhaps it should have been done a long time ago, but we are where we are. And there are other issues that need to be gone through, clarified, and in the spirit of what's happening at the moment, part of what our amendment does is, if the EU were to improve their standards, say on workers' rights, this requires government not to endorse that, but to guarantee through policy by Parliament that is brought back to Parliament in the future. In other words, Parliament will decide whether we accept new, better standards. That's also quite critical in terms of going forward.
What do you say to those Labour activists, maybe Labour MPs, who hearing that think, what are you doing? You are throwing Theresa May a potential lifeline of Labour support when she's on the ropes.
Well, what we're doing is we're drawing our red lines inside Parliament with a resolution that would tie the government's hand, any government's hand, in the future, in the negotiations.
But you could save her deal.
Well, we're premised on leaving. I suppose the premise in this for us is that we accept our manifesto, we accept the referendum result, that we're leaving the European Union. So how do we leave? This is about how we leave, and it's our red lines for how you leave. The Labour MPs who, of course, won't be very happy are those who want to overturn the referendum, overturn the manifesto they stood on, and have a second referendum or revoke Article 50 and keep us in the EU. So for them this is not going to be very good, but for those who accept our manifesto, and the Labour leadership of course does, and accept the result of the referendum and the Labour leadership does, this ought to be good news.
So do you think down the line, and you said it was the start of a process, do you think down the line Jeremy Corbyn could actually back or maybe abstain on a reworked May deal that included the Labour red lines?
Well, I think I can't speak for Jeremy Corbyn, I have no idea, but what is clear to me, and I think to others, is there is space for more red lines to be established, and for the Labour Party to do that through Jeremy would be very, very helpful. If we can assist in doing that, you know, these are traditional red lines, but actually they're real ones. They're real ones in terms of real people's lives. We need a good Brexit, and we're going to have to work together to ensure we get one, whoever is in power.
Okay, John Mann, thanks very much indeed. Anita, still an awfully long way to go in this whole Brexit process, but there are signs now of potentially some movement, with Mrs May very, very late in the day, it seems, trying now to reach out to some Labour MPs.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you for that.